Wominjeka, and welcome from the traditional lands of the Bunurong, Wurundjeri and Wadawurrung people. Wherever you are today and wherever you work, live and play, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country each of us is meeting on. We recognise your continuing connection to the land and waters and acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on this land and commit to building a brighter future together. My name is Sharon Braun and I'm an Associate Director of Programming with CEDA. I'm pleased to welcome you today to today's live stream discussion on embedding cultural awareness training across your business. We have a wonderful panel of practitioners who will share insights on how to foster genuine engagement and understanding across your workforce. Wominjeka literally means we come with purpose, and that's how we approach today's discussion. Today's live stream is the first in the 2023 First Nations Voices series, continuing discussions that we have hosted over the past 18 months on topics such as employment, education, housing and health. We joined with Minderoo Foundation's Generation 1 on the release of their first Indigenous Employment Index last May and closed out 2022 hosting a stellar panel of Indigenous leaders to discuss the 30-year legacy of Paul Keating's Redfern Address. CEDA also supports the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice to Parliament and will host a series of discussions in July together with the ullerustatement.org team to unpack the voice, what it is and what it isn't. We encourage you to keep up to date with these and other programs on CEDA's website at ceda.com.au. As always, the opportunity to actively participate in today's conversation is a mainstay of CEDA's forums. Follow CEDA across our social media channels and add your comments and key takeaways using the hashtag First Nations. Put your questions to the panel via our Pigeonhole app, which is available just below the live stream window on your screen, or log in on your devices by entering the URL ceda.pigeonhole.at and enter using the password First Nations. We will endeavour to ask as many of your questions as time allows, but to help us understand those questions with the broadest interest, please review and vote on the questions entered into the app by your fellow participants. Please also take a moment at the end of the live stream to rate your experience of today's discussion in Pigeonhole. Before we kick things off, I'd like to thank Workskil Australia for their support of today's live stream. Workskil is a not-for-profit organisation with over 35 years of supporting Australians to achieve sustained economic and social self-reliance by providing a range of employment, work experience, disability, youth, Indigenous and community services across New South Wales, South Australia, Western Australia and Victoria. Workskil has been an engaged member of CEDA for almost a decade, and we thank them for their sponsorship of today's discussion and their ongoing and active support. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our facilitator for today's discussion. Nicole Dwyer has been CEO of Workskil Australia since 2012 and has previously worked with KPMG providing advisory services to the government and NFP sectors on employment, education and Indigenous affairs. Nicole is a member of CEDA and Nicole is a member of AICD and a valued trustee of CEDA. Nicole, thank you for supporting us on today's live stream and for driving the ship. Over to you.
Thanks, Sharon, and welcome to everyone. I'd just like to call out that I'm on Kaurna lands today in Adelaide, and a warm welcome to over, I think, 300 people online today. I'd also like to acknowledge elders past, present and future, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today. My role is facilitator today. We have three excellent speakers who I'm about to introduce. While they do talking, they're going to give a short intro and set the scene about their backgrounds and who they are. If you can think of some fantastic questions to ask, please jump in on Pigeonhole. So I'd also like to just acknowledge we also have a reconciliation action plan, and we've been very engaged on this journey for the last sort of 8 to 10 years. And we're also very keen to learn today from our panel guests. So the three wonderful people we have with us today is Cristilee Houghton, who's the Head of Indigenous Affairs for the Coles Group. Topaz McAuliffe, who's the CEO of 15 Times Better, which is a wholly Indigenous-owned consultancy in this space, and Peter Morris, who's the General Manager of Reconciliation Action Plan Programs with Reconciliation Australia. So a fantastic lineup. So I'm going to start with Topaz, if I can throw to you to do some your opening statement. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks, Sharon, for the introduction as well. So Topaz McAuliffe, CEO of 15 Times Better. I'm up here on beautiful Gimmo country in Cairns, and myself, family ties to Moa and Mustig Islands up in the Torres Strait, which I don't ever get back there enough. Really, what I'm hoping to bring to the conversation today is, after spending more than a decade in the corporate sector, developing First Nations programs, started 15 Times Better, and we've taken those learnings in a really pragmatic and scalable way. And so our experience is very much around some consistent challenges that you might face in terms of how to embed cultural learning frameworks, or actually how do you develop what is an appropriate cultural learning framework, and often based on the maturity of your company, the challenges that come with scaling any type of program, resources, cost, some of those barriers. So they're things that I think we can speak to with a lot of authority around what we've seen has worked, and also where we sort of see the direction of what an effective cultural learning strategy will look like in the future with the, I guess, the current landscape that we're all experiencing at the moment. So thank you for having me today.
Thanks, Topaz. So over to you, Peter.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, thanks so much, Nicole, and it's good to be with you all. My name is Peter Morris. I have the great privilege of leading the RAP program at Reconciliation Australia. For those who don't know, the RAP program is a network of over 2,300 organizations that directly impact over 4 million Australians. That's more than a quarter of the working age population every single day. And so I'm coming to this conversation with somewhat of a US accent, depends who you're asking in terms of how strong they think it is, but with some international experience working with First Nations peoples in the US and in Central America, but also having led the program for the last 4 years, and thinking today about questions of the why. So why do organizations think about investing in cultural awareness and cultural safety within their workplaces? What are the benefits of that? From a very human perspective, how does it help to create a workplace where people feel comfortable bringing their whole selves? We have some data that tells us clearly that having a structured plan in place, like a RAP, that helps organizations build that support structure has a tangible impact, measurable impact on folks' experience in the workplace, feeling like they can bring their whole selves to work, specifically, obviously, in the context we're talking about today, thinking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but also a broader impact as well. There's also a sense that this conversation is obviously in the shadow, as Sharon showed at the outset, of the referendum that we're going to be talking about throughout the year. And I think there's a sense in which some of the 300 of you might have come to this conversation today with a sense of, I should do something. We're going to have this big referendum later in the year. Should we be doing more? And even not just a question that's in your mind, but an expectation that maybe your customers or your employees, especially younger employees, have. I want to work for a company that takes these kinds of issues seriously. So I think the conversation, which I'm super excited to be a part of this afternoon, is really that conversation about the why and then about the how. And in terms of RAPs, we really think about a long-term structured journey that supports organizations to take meaningful steps in an incremental way. That particularly this year, I think one of the danger signs, or one of the things that organizations could fall into, is being more performative than substantive in this space, wanting to kind of tick a box or look like they're doing the right thing, rather than really deeply thinking about how can we invest meaningfully in creating a culturally safe workspace, in terms of equipping our people to honor and respect First Nations peoples and cultures, and also more broadly. And then we've got some data that I'll look forward to sharing about later in terms of what's the result. So you have some really interesting information that we see that folks really enjoy being a part of some of these cultural learning strategies. And actually, the more you offer, the more people want. And so there are some really interesting kind of outcome-focused data points that we can talk about a little bit as well, but a really critical conversation. And again, thanks to CEDA and Nicole for hosting the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. And finally to Cristilee.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks very much for sharing your perspectives, Topaz and Peter. Some very interesting points you've already raised there that I can relate to. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Cristilee Houghton. I am the Head of Indigenous Affairs across the Coles Group, and I'm also a Pita Maiawali Karawali woman, so my family come from northwest Queensland. Today I'm joining you on the lands of the Yagara Gugurupul people in Ipswich, and I'm very proud to be able to live and work here. For me, I guess my perspective also is really focused on the why. Why do we do the work that we're doing? Why do we have focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, whether it be under a plan, a strategy, or a reconciliation action plan? And I think the work that I've seen has really focused on what is the benefits to an organisation around that. But for more broadly, I think it's really about understanding the value and having a real appreciation for the benefit we have of having 65,000 plus years of knowledge and expertise coming from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country. And a lot of times when you deliver training, no matter what level you're delivering the training at, it really does turn on a light bulb or give people an opportunity to think a bit more differently about something that they perhaps don't know or have been too afraid to ask a question about. And then it really makes people curious. So you get curious minds and you start to have curious conversations. And that's what I see a lot in my workforce. I have the benefit of working in a large organisation of over 130,000 people. So that means the level of influence that we can have is very broad, and the scope of the work that we do to deliver cultural awareness training or cultural capability really does set us up for, having a culturally safe framework around how we engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. I also think about organisational culture and really creating that sense of belonging for all team members. And I think this really extends, to setting the culture that if you're looking from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective or an Indigenous-led perspective, if you get that right, you're actually setting yourself up really well for creating good organisational culture, a sense of belonging for all people, and that broadens into the diversity and inclusion space as well. So I'll stop there and hand back over to you, Nicole. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So we're opening up for questions now, so keen to see some coming through, but I might just get us sort of kicked off, and this is to maybe all three of you. I think there's often a lot of goodwill in organisations to get a wrap up and or an employment strategy, but then often we don't see it well executed in a business. I'm keen to hear maybe from all three of you, what are some of the sort of those challenges and maybe practical things that businesses can do to sort of carry it through? And I might start with Topaz.
Yeah, perfect. And I'll just excuse up front that sometimes I don't make it sound as exciting as the work actually is, because I love what I do. But really kind of pragmatically, what we see that's missing consistently after spending a long time inside a very complex organisation, which was Wesfarmers and Coles Group, and then having had 2.5 years of working with 30 new clients across multiple industries, the challenges and the themes are pretty consistent. And where we see there is a lack of what we would call is scalable impact is that the business case and clarity around why the organisation is doing the activity is sometimes misunderstood, or it's not linked appropriately. And when I say the term business case, it throws a few people, but especially if you're working in the for-profit sector. And again, it is different across not-for-profit, and there are different areas with government as well. But if you don't understand what the activity is doing and impacting in terms of either your customers, your community, and then that shared value back to the organisation, it becomes really hard to scale any type of work. And in reality, I think a lot of people go into this with great intention, but not understanding that a clear strategy is looked at like a commercial piece of work, which therefore requires resourcing to underpin the delivery of that. And so when you've got your, your external commitments, whether it's a strategy like Coles has or whether it's reconciliation action plans, what are the tactical steps underneath that are going to help you deliver those actions? And are those actions right for your company, regardless of whether or not you have a restructure, whether there's acquisitions, whether there's a change in commercial direction? A really strong First Nations engagement strategy should link to the core purpose of your company and therefore make it really easy to continue to resource and scale over time. So we find that there's a lot of people doing fantastic work. And if you want your people to engage, you've got to make the engagement relative and give them context in their role at your company. So I always use the example, if you work at Woolworths or if you work at Coles, whilst outwardly facing, they look like two similar organisations inwardly, they're both very different organisations. So it's got to be inward facing, that you do your kind of review and analysis, as well as using those, best practice frameworks that are out there.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. And Peter, can you give us some tips from your point of view in this area?
Yeah, I might just say in a different accent some of the things that Topaz just said. Actually, I think it was a great answer, and I think that from our perspective, what we've learned through 16 years of the RAP program is that leadership is critical. So again, getting to that why, and getting from this is something we should do to this is something that we want to do. This is something that is about who we are. I think that's a really critical piece, that organizations don't just start ticking this box. And obviously the RAP program started with 8 organizations in 2006, and today it's 2,000 plus. There's a sense of kind of peer pressure to be a part of it. And one of the things that we do counsel organizations against and counsel more kind of intentional strategic engagement around is making sure that this is meaningful. We had a program evaluation in 2019 that the standout quote for me that I think I should put on t-shirts or something is that leadership engagement and RAP success are synonymous. So if you don't have a leader, especially a senior leader in the business who is 100% behind what you're trying to do, especially in this space we're talking about today, then it's just going to be people getting bored in a conference room or on a Zoom call or clicking through on an online cultural awareness training. It's not going to have the impact on the culture of the business that you want to see it have. And many of you, I would imagine all of you that are on this call would like to see it have. I think the other thing that we've seen is that accountability matters. So RAPs provide structures to have KPIs and other things linked to elements of promoting reconciliation and better understanding, giving folks incentives to learn and be a part of this process. And again, like I said at the beginning, one of the really interesting things is that individuals, and there's academic research as well as research that we've done at Reconciliation Australia that says you participate in 2 or 3 reconciliation activities in your business, you're more likely to be wanting to participate in more, you're more likely to accept key facts about Australia's history, have interest in spending your own time and learning about the traditional owners where you live, a whole bunch of kind of virtuous cycle additional impacts that come. And so we see that kind of accountability and kind of incentive structure is really important. The other thing which we can't say enough is that sustainability and adaptability, some of the things Topaz just spoke to, are also really important. So the RAP as a long-term structured journey is really important, because these are not things that you can kind of flick on and off a light switch of cultural safety or cultural awareness within your business. It's an ongoing process. Every time a new starter comes in the door, and at some of the big businesses like Coles, that's every few minutes, I'd imagine, Cristilee. So you're really in an ongoing process of renewal of the culture and making sure that folks understand the importance of that. The final thing that I think the structure is really important to support is privileging First Nations voices. So I love the fact that I'm the only white guy on the call. There's not enough of that in corporate Australia and organizational Australia. But the fact that First Nations voices within your organization or within your stakeholder kind of framework need to be guiding some of the principles and goals of the reconciliation activities that you're committed to, of the cultural awareness that you're investing in. And so that's another really key piece that, again, through RAPs or whatever tool you might use, organizations need to think about. How do we put First Nations voices at the center of guiding what we're doing? Really, really critical caveat, not doing all the work. It's still on people who look like me to do most of the work, but guiding the work and being critical to defining what success looks like is another really critical piece of this as well.
Excellent. Thank you. That's great. And then Cristilee, over to you, and maybe just giving us some more context around what happens at Coles, because I think people would probably not understand the huge volume of people you've employed and some of the great stats that Coles has in this space as well.
Yeah, thank you. And look, I think Peter and Topaz really answered a lot of that and provided great context. So from a Coles perspective, some of the I guess the challenges that we have is the fact that we are such a large organisation, because we have such a high volume. And when I say turnover, it's not always turnover, it's movement across the business. So you might start working with a particular area of the business and you build good relationships and you build a plan towards how you're going to roll out training to different areas. And then that key contact that you've got has moved on to another area. So you have to restart the process and start rebuilding and continue that work. I think for me, what I've seen not only at Coles and in other organisations, I've had the privilege of working in the media sector, in aviation, in the tertiary sector, and across a lot of different sectors delivering this work. Really, if you don't have a good strategy that ties you to the foundations, and I think one of the core foundations of any strategy or wrap in this space should be cultural learning, then you're not going to get a successful delivery or outcome, because what you're missing is actually understanding Indigenous knowledges and concepts and the history that's formed us being in the position we're in today. The other learning that I would take from all of my experiences is that a lot of times these strategies, they might be driven by middle management. And so you've got this kind of bottom-up approach trying to embed a training program across a business. And to, I think, your point, Topaz, around having a good strategy that's embedded in the structure of the organisation really does make a difference, because you need top down and bottom up. And so you need leadership from a key leader in the business that's going to champion something. At Coles, we've been fortunate that we've had that. We've got numerous ambassadors that are across our leadership team. We've got board endorsement. We've got board support. So it's really, and we've also had the longevity. So our plan has existed since 2009. We're coming up to 14 years of doing this work, and we haven't progressed yet to having a reconciliation action plan, but some of that's driven by the fact that we have been so successful in implementing some of our strategies, and that has really been around employment. And we are one of the largest employers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the country, with over really good representation also in our leadership in the business. And I think that success that we've had has really been fundamental to building up awareness of the program that we have at Coles and trying to engage with community well. But also that really leans on us being able to train and educate our team members so that team members feel safe and supported to stay there. They feel safe and supported to be retained and think about opportunities to progress in our business. And that is also around how to have the appropriate conversations. How do we have conversations about culture in an organisation like Coles, which in retrospect really reflects the communities in which we live and serve. So 130,000 people broadly. It is very diverse, and that gives you a good balance and mix of lots of different cultural backgrounds. But I think having a good fundamental, balance of training that you're delivering in your business and tying those to KPIs, being really clear about why you're delivering the training and how it, impacts on the broader business and the outcomes you're trying to deliver is really the message that you need to give to your leaders.
Excellent. Thank you, Cristilee. There's a few questions coming in now. So the first one I was going to ask that's had a few votes is there will always be people who don't see or understand the need for cultural training. How do you tackle this reaction, especially at senior levels? Who would like to grab that one?
I've got that one. Yeah. So I think this is something, and again, I don't want to be offensive here and generalise people into two categories, but often what we find is that, especially at that exec level, again, it's presenting the business case around why would they engage in the activities. So you get people who I feel like get the emotional connection really quickly and clearly, and probably have their own personal learning journey outside of the organisation, or if you've got board members who are on other organisations' board and see that there's different levels. And then you've got the analytical people who just need to understand the numbers and that they can't be negatively impacting the business's bottom line. And I feel like that is essentially the two ways that you can position this. But in terms of the why, I think Cristilee's point and Peter's around, there is actually a foundational element around the why. It wasn't taught in schools historically. It isn't still taught accurately, depending on where you're located. So the true history around the why is something that is really hard to scale and get out there when it's not embedded in our education system as yet. And so those early stages around that critical element have to happen. But then it's actually the next phase of that evolution, in that there is no one-size-fits-all cultural learning product. And I think as a company, sometimes it's actually understanding that a particular type of learning is needed for a particular stage of you at your company. So if you're trying to get executives on board, there are specific providers who do a fantastic job at engaging executives, but you have to work with them to make it relevant to the business and contextualize it. And then there are other providers out there who do fantastic work if you're working with frontline staff who are supporting First Nations employees. So there's actually different products and what we would say is like a cultural learning matrix that's out there. So I think you have to understand a little bit more around what's the purpose of doing a session. And if you can't answer that yourself, it's really hard to answer that or give that to your leaders to then convince them why it needs to happen. I would also say that every session that I've been in, not one person has not walked out understanding that they need to move forward and actually get more people across the why. So there is the reality that sometimes the product doesn't land very well and the session doesn't give you what you need. So there has to be rigor around who you're using, why you're using them, and making sure that the relevant information is being shared, as well as that foundation, that critical foundation piece as well. And then I do think it's rare, but any opportunity to have those on-country experiences where you get people out of their boardroom into the communities in a way that they're not representing as a large corporate walking in there. It's more around, I'm a person who just wants to understand Australia's history and why this is such an important process. But I think it's more just the purpose and the why around the sessions and then making sure that the session does land for the audience. And that requires you to do a little bit more shaping, knowing how your organisation has maybe had successful delivery of other programs, D&I pillars, things in the past.
I can build on that. I guess from my perspective of what we do at the moment, we've really had to try to evolve our program from which was, delivered face-to-face before COVID to being, very much an online process post-COVID or during COVID. And the interesting thing about that is time started to get shaved off. So you started to get pressure from the business around we can't afford 3 hours online. And actually, you've got to question whether 3 hours online is the best delivery. And we've then tried to sort of cut down to being 90 minutes to 2 hours, where we've got this really niche delivery with a follow-up session, listening session that's hosted 6 weeks later to kind of talk about reflections. So that's worked really well. Then we've also gone back to sort of face-to-face delivery, and we've sometimes coupled an online session with a face-to-face delivery session to do much deeper dive into a particular topic. So it might be around bias, or it could be around something that's really come up in a training session. We've selected cohorts of the business that we just are very specific. You need to do the minimum. The minimum might be a 2-hour online session. And then we've also looked at online learning content and trying to make some of the online learning content, particularly the introduction to the plan or introduction to our why, mandatory for all learners in the business. So I think, Peter, to your point before around KPIs and linking it to people's STIs in an organisation, I think that does add some benefit and weight, because it means that it's mandatory for people to undertake and for you to achieve your goals in your organisation. But to the question that's asked around how do you do that in an environment where you don't necessarily have support, it really comes down to going back to your organisation's values. What do they value? How does this link into your broader D&I strategy? Why do you have this to begin with? And how do you get those champions in your organisations, whether they're high up in the organisation or not, to really come out as allies and support this and, influence other stakeholders to come along on the journey? And really a lot of the work I feel like I'm doing is constantly trying to influence different people and build good relationships with people. And then you find that people come along and they sign up because just generally having a chat, they feel the passion that I have or my team has about why we're doing the work that we're doing, why it exists, and the value add that brings to over 4,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that work in our organisation. And when you think about that, and you can tell them, well, did you know that creating one employment opportunity or one supplier chain opportunity for a supplier has an impact on an individual, a community, and a family? And you might not have looked at it through that lens before, but when you're talking about economic exclusion of a whole group of people in our country, you start to sort of think about that a little bit differently. And you go, well, maybe I need to understand that a bit more.
Well, and I think that from my perspective, and you talked to this, Cristilee, in a number of different ways, but motivation is really important. I think the first thing that's behind the question, which is a really important acknowledgement, I know that this is a fantastic webinar, possibly the best that CEDA's ever done, but if you're one of the 300 people who've tuned in for this webinar, you're probably already drinking the Kool-Aid, right? You're probably already on team. And what's behind the question that's a really helpful acknowledgement is that there will always be detractors, and they may be very high up in the business. And I think one of the pathways that we encourage organizations, we coach some of our Stretch and Elevate, some of our leading partners around, is how do you create a pathway to match motivation with the value that you're delivering, right? So it might not be, this is the right thing to do. It might be, this is something that our investors expect. It might be, this is something that's going to help us to retain employees, because we know from the data that people who are involved in these kind of multiple touch points in terms of reconciliation and particularly cultural awareness are more likely to be happy in their job, are more likely to stay, less likely to look for other jobs. They're really defined and clear. It might be the person who loves the kind of data that I'm spouting off right now. That might be the motivation that gets them. And it's really about thinking, how do I, in any of these conversations, create that pathway? As a dad, I think one of the interesting things for me is there's a lot of parents across different kind of political viewpoints, experiences, whose kids, like Topaz was saying, are learning in schools about some of these things that those of us who grew up even fairly recently going to schools in Australia did not learn in school. And this exposure in the workplace actually provides the things that my kids love talking about the most at NRW events and things to do with cultural awareness that connect with what they're learning at school. And maybe that's a really critical motivation that's going to get someone across the line to be part of these trainings. And again, one of the things that we know is when they're designed right, to Topaz's point, and when you're thoughtful in terms of how you draw folks in, there's generally a very positive impact in terms of folks' desire to act differently, learn more on their own time, those kinds of things as well, which are critical parts of the journey and the value proposition that you're putting in front of your organization.
Thank you. So another question that's come in talks to often businesses have a number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees, and they get leaned on a lot. So how do you protect those employees from kind of wearing the cultural load of a business? And I'm just thinking in terms of the context, we're going into this referendum as well coming up this year, maybe some ideas around that as well. Who wants to jump in?
I'm happy to talk to this one. Initially, I think, look, if you're an Indigenous person that is taking on a specific role, you're always going to end up with, a heavy cultural load. And I know for me, that looks like community engaging with me, and it looks like team members engaging with me. And sometimes that might be filtering where I direct them, or might be supporting and assisting myself. And that's above and beyond your day-to-day role, right? I think we all end up with that responsibility. But what I've seen a shift sort of starting to happen, and I'm working on this at the moment as well, is how do we start to educate and inform other leaders and bring allies along the journey with us so that they can actually take on some of the responsibilities. And sometimes that could come from having a good strategy, to Peter's point before with a wrap, having KPIs that really tie other people to carry that load for you. And I think I've seen it in some other instances where it's a bit of the reverse, where you've got Indigenous team members that want to actually have the responsibility and have the accountability as well. And so how do you do the reverse of that, where you want to share the load across an organisation? And I think it can be a complex situation to navigate, because Indigenous-led perspectives can be very strong perspectives with very good reason. You've got lived experiences that you bring to the table. And sometimes when you have to let go of that, you're perhaps handing something on to another area where someone might not have that experience. They don't have the expertise that you might have around a specific initiative. So I think there's varying views to look at that. I also think another way to consider it is really thinking about where there is the opportunity to bring your allies and your networks together. So I guess from a Coles perspective, in the last year, we launched a First Nations team member network. We have a committee of Indigenous team members who we can engage with, and we can test ideas and initiatives that we've got, and we can obtain feedback from them and suggestions around how we curate or we do things a little bit differently. We also are expanding that to allies in our organisation, because we recognise in an organisation of our scale, we can't deliver it all. Like, you're going to push burnout. You're going to be carrying all these things that you don't have the capacity to deliver. And as an organisation, we have people that are always putting their hands up saying, I want to support, but you don't have a mechanism to hand the work over to them to support it. So we're doing it by setting up the structure of having good networks and utilising good governance and a process for governance around how we allocate areas. So it might be National Rec Week. It's not something that's led by Indigenous Affairs, but it's actually led by allies across the business who might be operational, and they can get to the ground and they can get the messages out across the business where we need that to go.
Fantastic. That's great.
If I can jump in there, I think love everything that Cristilee said, and I think the end part answer to the question is really critical as well, in terms of thinking about the fact that our theory of change, proven over 16 years with the RAP program, is that RAP should be guided by the voices of First Nations people, but the responsibility for the majority of the work should rest with non-Indigenous people within the business. And as Cristilee just illustrated and put so well, that's a really hard line to walk effectively. And that's where effective governance systems, that's where we see through the RAPs, both the RAP working groups and the RAP steering committee that is generally about bringing leaders together, and sometimes also external advisors who can provide that kind of guidance and kind of marching orders for non-Indigenous folks to understand these are the places that we can add value. Because I think there's a huge challenge this year ahead in terms of effectively supporting First Nations employees, especially for businesses, and many of them that may go on the record for the Yes campaign, or may even just be identifying as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And the reality is, statistics tell us that a lot of Australians don't have regular interactions with First Nations people. So if they meet an Aboriginal person, they want you to be their new best friend, and answer all their questions. And in a business context, that can be really challenging. The other side of that coin, though, is that I think a lot of non-Indigenous folks, and we've talked to a lot of non-Indigenous executives within RAP organizations, are kind of like, we not be doing anything here, or what should we be doing here in terms of the voice and the conversation about the referendum? Is it the right thing for us as non-Indigenous people to be a part of this conversation? And I think we want a similar line that's difficult to walk is you want to cultivate non-Indigenous allies who are better at self-censoring and saying, should I be stepping back? That's the right question for allies to ask most of the time. And that's the kind of ally that you want, right? But there are times, and I think this year is going to be one, where allies need to step forward and help share the load with non-Indigenous colleagues, and to think about ways in which they can do that in a supportive environment. And it's those governance structures and systems that enable those kind of conversations to take place in a way that better enables meaningful conversations in the business. Because we don't want to assume for Indigenous colleagues that they want us to step in. And we don't also want to assume that they want non-Indigenous colleagues to step back. It's about having that conversation and having the space for the conversation that's really critical as well.
And I'll just add one more point to build on that as well, and just linking it back to again, a really clear strategy, which actually tells you in the space of 12 months, here's what we are going to deliver as an organisation. And then behind that then helps you with, well, what is the governance structure? What are the entities that we need to make sure are set up to help deliver on that? Where is accountability sitting? And if you actually have that set up and it's really clear what the plan is and you're able to articulate that to the organisation, what you can then set up is a mechanism for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees and team members to participate on their own terms if they choose to. I think there's that assumption that every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person is interested in actually working with their company to do this. It's not the case, but I think you need to allow people the opportunity to do that in a way that works for them. One thing that I will say as well is that if you don't get the right, rules of engagement around these types of activities as well, what you can end up being left with is a number of staff who give you some great suggestions and ideas that never come to fruition, and you end up with a deflated group of employees. And so what is right for your company will not be right for the company next to you. So it's actually, again, linking it back to what are you there to deliver as a company, and then overlay that with First Nations engagement and considerations, strong governance, strategy, plan, and then also what role do you want your employees to play? And what I would also say, which is probably more common around why there's so much cultural load, is there isn't the breadth of employees out there for you to draw on either. And so the question would be, well, actually, if you don't have, great representation from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, is that something you should be looking at fixing? Or if you can't fix it straight away, it does take about 10 years to embed sustainable employment, then who are you looking to partner with from an external perspective to help you on that interim step of the journey, to be able to get the right information as well? But don't dismiss what you're bringing to the table from an organisation's perspective. Again, it's got to be contextualised to your company for it to all make sense. And then people will probably find that their time given to you is valued. Often feedback is, this is the third time I've participated in a listening group and you haven't listened to me, so therefore I'm not going to turn up again. So it is respecting and valuing their time.
Fantastic.
And one more thing, Nicole, sorry. I'm mad at myself for not saying this in my first answer to this question. Compensate for cultural load. Simply put, this assumption that because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need to or are called in to participate in different ways, and often, as Topaz and Cristilee just shared, often in a way that's really kind of optional but not really optional, they should be compensated for that. And honestly, there's a kind of structural racism that says you're an Aboriginal person in this business and we're going to add an additional thing to you, but we're going to pay you the same as the non-Indigenous person right next to you. So that's another thing that RAPs and similar strategies need to think about, is providing that structure that enables businesses to think about the cultural load and the expectations that are being placed on First Nations employees.
Fantastic, thanks. And Topaz, I was just going to throw to you again, you talked to me previously about where if the KPIs are not sitting with the right group, can you just talk a little bit more about that in terms of what that's one of the reasons RAPs may fail?
Yeah, and that was really around getting to a point where you can actually put KPIs in is also a journey as well. That's not something that happens in day one, but we just use the example of often we're dealing with clients and their reconciliation action plans, the delivery and the commitment of, if it's an employment KPI, often sits with human resources, but they don't actually have control over the outcome of the interview and providing the person the employment opportunity or the job. So actually the accountability and who you're supporting is sometimes a little bit misplaced. Similar example with procurement. Often targets for supplier diversity are sitting with procurement. Procurement are there to run a trusted process and to make sure that due diligence is being followed. However, the outcome of that contract often sits with the category manager in the business. And so a lot of effort is spent with an area that I think is already on board, but it's actually the decision makers in the business that need to have the accountability sitting with them. How you get to a point of making sure that it's embedded in their KPIs comes again from that clear strategy. The business from a board level down has agreed to commit to these activities over the course of the next, 1, 2, 3 years. It's embedded into roles like it is any other objective in your commercial organisation or your not-for-profits as well. And that I think it's being really clear on who has got the ability to influence the outcome is where a lot of your effort should be spent. Fantastic.
And Cristilee, can you just talk how Coles does it, given the size of your business? How do you get those recruitment decisions sort of heading in the right direction?
Look, we've had a lot of success in this space, so I feel like it's embedded in our organisation that it is what we do. We have made very public commitments around our targets, but regardless of those public commitments within our organisation, the strategy is really well renowned. It was interesting being out on country in an immersion last week. I was talking to store managers and they said, I know in our recruitment report there's an asterisk next to Indigenous team members, so they know that there's a process where people flow through in the process and they can see where they're getting Indigenous applicants. And we've really tried to tailor a lot of different processes to not accommodate, but really to make sure we get the best traction. So our Indigenous recruitment numbers are higher in terms of the rate of higher than the non-Indigenous recruitment rate in a lot of locations across the country. And some of that comes from leaders being well-informed, well-educated, knowing the area which they live. So if you're in a highly dense population where there's Indigenous community members, then you'd want to make sure that you're employing a reasonable number of Indigenous hires into your store, and the stores reflect the communities in which you live and serve. So I feel like the process really does have a big part to play. We have looked at onboarding and also the recruitment process in a sense of the steps you go through. And I know that in some instances, video interviewing and online applications can be challenging for some community members. And that's everything from might not have access to Wi-Fi, you might not have access to being able to, and you just might not feel comfortable doing a video interview. So we've scaled that to look at, well, how do we invite candidates into a store and how do we support that process? Sometimes, you know, that process goes really well, and other times you're just doing such a volume that you may miss some candidates. But that's where we have an Indigenous Affairs team. We do a lot of work with our business partners around having conversations around what we need to improve, what we might need to adjust. But I think more generally, because we have been leading in this space and doing this work for such a long time now, it's not owned by the Indigenous Affairs team. It's something that's owned by other parts of the business. It's led by talent acquisition. It's a conversation with the talent acquisition team around what the process looks like. And it's also about making sure that on the ground with our operators, they actually have done cultural awareness training. They understand the why this exists, and they understand the value in making sure that not only Indigenous, but other diverse groups are actually supported through our recruitment process. So I hope that covers the question off well, but I think it really does come down to your process and making sure that you're reviewing your systems, you're looking at the process, you're thinking about whether, you know, the processes you're embedding are actually excluding people from participating. We've done that, we've looked at that, and we've adapted to what we need in different locations to support candidates. And that's where we've had great success and traction with our process.
Fantastic. All right. And I think we've probably got one more we can get through. This one's had a few votes. A lot of RAPs focus internally, such as recruitment and supply. How do we take the next step and encourage RAP actions to look beyond that? For example, how we engage with customers or stakeholders. Who wants to?
Yeah, maybe I'll take that as a leader, being the designated RAP person here. I would say that long-term structured journey that I've referred to a couple of times is a really critical piece of that conversation, right? Is that we actually have a proven model that takes organizations from a reflect RAP, which really is looking at some of those internal pieces, through an innovate RAP, which is about starting to think about having put basic building blocks in place. We can start to test things that are specific to our organization or our sector, things that we can do that are creative, that are particularly outward looking as well, like this questioner says. And then further on, as organizations move through their RAP journey, we also have the stretch RAP, which is actually about supporting organizations to embed reconciliation throughout their business. So that's about thinking the customer experience, if we're a customer-facing organization, the HR folks, the folks in finance, the folks in IT, everyone within the business is connected to these principles around reconciliation. And that's where our top 10% or so of the RAP network sits. But that takes, as Topaz has really helpfully pointed out, that takes time, right? And you have to start somewhere with an integrated strategy that helps move your organization along in that journey, so that you're not starting to try and create strategies for the customer. An example might be through, trying to honor Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art, but not having the capacity internally to think about what would be a respectful process to seek out art that we could show in our conference room, or that we could put on shirts for our team members, or what have you. You jump straight to customers or outward looking things without putting some of those basic and important building blocks in place, as Taylor and Cristilee have both said, in a way that's tailored to your organization's sphere of influence. You're more likely to have problems as you start looking beyond the business. Now, Reflect and Innovate RAPs also provide a kind of structured process to enable organizations to start looking outside, for sure, from the beginning. But it's about taking that process incrementally and not rushing it in a way that is unhelpful for the organization, and also unhelpful for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stakeholders in the business and beyond.
I can probably just build on that a little bit, and those who may or may not know me on the call know that I'm always in a rush and want things to happen tomorrow in terms of outcomes and impact. So I think after having, a number of years in the corporate sector and understanding what we think is a really strong shared value framework that is commercially viable, being able to get to the outcome piece has been something that does need to happen quicker based on where a number of corporates are at. So some who've been on the journey for a while and haven't seen that impact piece after a few years are starting to ask that question. I think what we found is it's linking back to they've got these commitments, but the tactical elements of understanding how do we deliver those and what impact does that link to, that piece of work has been missed. And so I think if you're finding yourself in that boat, which I think is a fairly common one at the moment, it's taking a step back to go, what is the core purpose of our business? And if there's one or two things that we've got the opportunity to scale in the next decade because it links to our company, that is almost what your starting point should be as well. And you might need a bit of help to get to that outcome if it's not clear to you. But if you're an insurance company, if you're a retail supermarket, if you're an airline, based on who you are and what you do, and also what I always have found over the years is there's an element of First Nations engagement that actually contributes positively to commercial outcomes. So it does actually solve challenges that the business currently has. And the Coles example is that when they were really struggling to get people in remote and rural parts of Australia where there were footprints, and there was absolutely no representation in those stores, the question was actually, well, if there's no representation from an employee perspective, there's absolutely no customers who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander shopping here as well. And so the ability to understand that in places like Kununurra and Cairns, huge footprint of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, why is that community not engaging with your organisation? And so I think the underpinning of everything you do has to come with that reconciliation lens. But I do think linking it to the impact line of sight to an outcome is something that everybody seems to be asking for. And so, as Peter said, doing it the right way, you do have to be cautious, but I think there's enough success stories out there that you can learn from, i.e., Cristilee and the work that she's doing at Coles, to understand how do you actually embed those foundations as part of a core strategy early, and then you're building on that every year, but you're working towards what is scalable impact. I always come across the organisations where they're doing a lot of activity and it's diluting their effort. So it's actually understanding, I think the conversations have a lot of customers who've had reconciliation action plans is they're misinterpreting the definition of some of the deliverables within the RAP as well. And so what, I've learned from RA in the last couple of years is it's up to you to define what the practical deliverable looks like. They're just giving you, this is the framework that you need to deliver it in. So I think it's about stopping and understanding actually what we've been doing historically, is that what the future looks like? And I think at the moment there's a bit of a license to stop and pause to get it right, because the pressure and the implications of getting it wrong are far greater. And just touching back on one of the very first questions around getting those particular individuals understanding the benefit of cultural learning, there's a real risk now if you're a leader, you're an ASX-listed business specifically, you're an organisation, you're a director or an executive of one of these companies. I always talk about Indigenous affairs as similar to what OH&S was 15 years ago. No one really understood it. Everybody was a bit scared of it. But actually, fundamentally, it was there to save lives and to improve working, ways of working for people. That's what Indigenous affairs is. So there's a 101 that if you don't feel like you've got that foundation of understanding and you're at that level, you need to get it. And because without it in the next couple of years, it will become clear those leaders that don't have it. But all of it's out there to be found and to be engaged in. It's not reinventing the wheel. There's some phenomenal providers out there who offer great service and support. And I think as the corporates that we deal with, you've actually got each other to lean on, and everybody's really generous with their sharings and their learnings as well. So I'm sure, Cristilee will probably get a few taps on the shoulders after this, but everybody's really generous with wanting to see people succeed in this space. So I think if that's your framework that you've got, it's more around understanding what does that look like internally for you. And then the other thing too, if you've been on the journey for a while and you haven't had some great success and therefore you can find it a little bit hard to drive it, you need to understand what are some of the quick wins that show the value in what it is that you're doing. And those quick wins sometimes aren't complicated in understanding how to achieve some outcomes. So yeah, I think it's a question that's coming up a lot, is direct line of sight that your activity wants to be showing the outcome. And that seems to be what helps everybody understand why you're doing it.
Fantastic. Okay, I think we've only got a few minutes left. So Cristilee, did you want any last comment before we wrapped up?
Yeah, look, I think my biggest takeaway from all of this is that, you know, having the good plan gives you good foundation to start with. Having some really clear tie into a broader business strategy is always fundamental. But I think it's also about bringing your stakeholders along on a journey too. So whether that be internal or external, and that question was sort of directed to thinking about customers and community, I guess. For me, coming into Coles, I've been at Coles just over 2 years, and my first take was that I didn't, as a community member, really understand what Coles did for my community. And so I was kind of like, how do we shift the way that we messages to community and break down the language so that blackfellas feel like they're engaging with the content we're putting out? Because when you work for a big brand, it's big branded content. So we focused on that for quite some time. And what that really got us was a lot more traction in the way that community was looking at what we were doing. And I think making sure that you're actually engaging with those, you know, community members in which you're serving is really important. Taking the time to listen, the best feedback, and sometimes it may come across in a way that doesn't feel like it's feedback. It could be perceived as critical. I think there's always some really good, you know, nuggets to take from that, because people are giving you a gift when they're giving you feedback to say, this is what we're not seeing, or this is what we're not understanding why you're doing this. And a good example of where we've taken on some feedback from community has been around artwork. So in a lot of our stores that we've launched, particularly if it's in a regional remote location, we have worked, or with new stores where we've had a high Indigenous population, we have really worked with the local community, the traditional owners, around, we want to start a relationship with you before we do a transaction, thinking about, you know, just setting up a new store, for example. And where we've had really great outcomes has been that we bring the traditional owners in, or the local person in that actually works with us. They form a good relationship. They link us with an artist, or an artist comes in and we talk about the story of the local area. We've embedded artwork into a site, and there's storytelling that goes with that. So by the time you get to launching the store, local people know that there's a store there. Local people come and want to be employed there. There's signposting that makes you feel like you're comfortable when you walk in there, because it's a place that represents our culture and makes you feel good. But the feedback that we got was that we didn't want to see, community didn't want to see like national branded artwork. They wanted their own artwork in local locations that represented their stories in the stores, which, you know, when you're thinking of an organisation the scale of Coles, that's costly to our organisation, because it would be very easy to roll out a national branded artwork that kind of reflects our business and our message. We have really tried to take that local approach. We have listened to community, and we do know that in a lot of communities you have very strong views and you have very strong stories linking us to country and history there. So that's an approach where we actually went, no, we need to hear this, because for us to succeed here and for us to do well and to really value customers and community in line with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander plan, we needed to do it in a certain way. And I'm really proud that we really pushed on with that approach, and that it has given us the outcomes that it has. But had we have gone the other path, we may have lost a bit of respect. We may have lost some stakeholders who go, and you're not listening to us and we're not feeling heard. And I feel like anytime we're developing a strategy, it needs to be informed by Indigenous voices, whether that's in our organisation or external to our organisation. So, you know, the good relationships that we've built over a long period of time, taking time to actually go and talk to people about what we've done, how we've done it, what they think about that, what they think we could be doing differently. And is there blind spots that we've got to things that are existing out in the community now that we could be doing differently?
Fantastic. Unfortunately, we have hit our end of time. I just want to thank Topaz, Peter and Cristilee for their time today. I think you'll all agree they have some very, very valuable insights on the reconciliation process, the embedding cultural competency and safety in your business. Thank you all for attending today. I hope you enjoyed today's event. I did. I found it very, very informative, and I learnt lots as well. So thank you, and thanks CEDA for putting it on today.